I was standing in the quiet village cemetery of Cranford, staring at the odd scene before me. The local vicar, Reverend Alastair Beaumont, stood near the freshly disturbed grave with an expression of disbelief, his thin lips pressed tightly together. The crowd of onlookers had gathered behind the old stone wall that separated the cemetery from the rest of the village, their faces pale and filled with curiosity or dread, some of both, I imagine. The cemetery, usually so serene, had taken on a disconcerting air of foreboding that morning. I turned to look at Hercule Poirot, who stood just a few paces behind me, observing the scene with a look of detached interest. I felt that familiar surge of admiration for the little Belgian detective, whose mind was already whirring through calculations and deductions that I could scarcely follow. His neat bowler hat and carefully tailored suit, always so immaculate, never a thread out of place, seemed entirely out of sync with the scene unfolding around him. He was the epitome of order in a place of chaos. "Mon ami," Poirot said softly, his voice tinged with a slight French accent. "What is it that disturbs the people of Cranford so?" "Surely it is no ordinary grave that brings such alarm," I followed, his gaze noting the rows of gravestones, most of them weathered by time, but there was one in particular that had drawn everyone's attention. The name on the headstone was that of Sir Edward Featherstone, one of Cranford's wealthiest and most prominent men, who had gone missing several months ago. His sudden disappearance had caused a stir in the village, and now a grave with his name had become the site of this strange mystery. But it wasn't Sir Edward's body that lay in the grave, that much was certain. "Ah, but it is the body of—"
"Another?" Poirot murmured, his gaze sharp and focused as he examined the scene. "This grave is a lie, Hastings. It tells a story that is not true, a tale we must unravel."
I frowned, my confusion deepening. "But Poirot, surely the body must be Sir Edward's. Who else could it be? They must have buried him in the wrong plot." "No, no," Poirot interjected, waving a hand as though dismissing my words. "There are things you do not yet see, my friend. Look closely." I obeyed, squinting at the small crowd that had gathered by the grave. Among them was Lady Florence Featherstone, Sir Edward's widow. I had known her for some time. Her grief over her husband's disappearance had been palpable, though I had never quite trusted the nuances of her sorrow. Lady Featherstone, in her dark mourning dress, stood at the edge of the grave, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. She was clutching her handkerchief tightly, her knuckles white against the delicate fabric.
"I cannot believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "That is not my husband! It cannot be!" Her words carried a tremor of panic, and yet something about her tone struck me as forced. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had convinced
herself of a truth, even if that truth was not entirely believable. Poirot's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly, as he observed Lady Featherstone's reaction. He nodded to himself as though confirming something I had not yet seen. "Perhaps she protests too much, yes?" Poirot said, his words quiet but sharp. "She does not seem convinced, and yet her body betrays her, does it not?" I glanced back at Lady Featherstone, who had turned her head away as if to avoid further scrutiny. I could see her shaking slightly, though she tried to mask it with an air of dignity. Still her eyes were wide, and her lips were pressed so tightly together that they appeared almost pinched. Was it grief or something else? The doctor, Dr. Gilbert Ashford, who had been attending to Sir Edward's medical needs for years, stood nearby. He was a nervous-looking man with a thin face and an air of constant discomfort. His eyes flitted back and forth between Lady Featherstone and the grave, as though afraid to commit himself to any opinion. "Dr. Ashford, "What do you make of this?" I asked, stepping toward him. He looked up, startled by the question, and quickly adjusted his spectacles. I cannot say for certain, Captain Hastings," he stammered. "I have no reason to believe that this is not Sir Edward. After all, he was missing for months, but I must admit this is all rather confusing." He hesitated, and I caught the faintest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I did not attend the burial personally, of course. The vicar performed the rites, but I had my hands full with other matters." Poirot, who had been listening carefully, now stepped forward. "Ah, and you are certain, Dr. Ashford, that it is not your hands that are full of something more?" he said with a sharp glance. "A doctor who has seen his share of bodies should know what one looks like, n'est-ce pas?" Dr. Ashford's face flushed crimson, and he quickly cleared his throat. "I assure you, Poirot, I am a professional." I was about to press him further when I heard a soft murmur of confusion from the vicar, Reverend Beaumont, who had been standing apart from the others. His face was pale, and his lips trembled as he stepped forward to examine the body himself. I cannot make sense of this," he muttered. "I was here when we buried him. I saw Sir Edward with my own eyes." He trailed off, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the grave marker. Poirot's eyes flicked from one person to another, taking in every subtle detail. He was processing, calculating. The quiet hum of his mind seemed to fill the space around us, and I could almost hear the little grey cells working away. "What do you think, Poirot?" I asked, though I already suspected that my friend was well ahead of me in the game. Poirot straightened up, smoothing the lapels of his suit with a careful hand. "The truth, mon ami, lies not in the body, but in the details. The body, it is
A ruse, a falsehood, wrapped in flesh." He gave me a pointed look, his eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. "But we are not yet finished. No, this is merely the beginning." I glanced back at the grave, trying to make sense of it.
Nothing added up, but I had no doubt that Poirot was already forming a theory, one that would uncover the hidden truths of this village, of Lady Featherstone's strange grief, and of the dark forces at play behind the scenes. But what I did not yet know what Poirot knew all too well, was that this was only the first thread in a much larger tapestry of lies, deception, and, ultimately, murder. The drive to Cranford was brief, but deeply unsettling. As I neared the village, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over me since the discovery of the wrong grave. I had spent the past few hours trying to make sense of the situation, but the more I thought about it, the less certain I became. How could the body buried beneath Sir Edward Featherstone's headstone not be Sir Edward himself? And why had Lady Featherstone reacted the way she did? It was all too strange, too contradictory. When I reached the cottage where Poirot was staying, I found him in the study, standing before the window and watching the rain fall steadily outside. He turned when I entered, his eyes gleaming with quiet intensity, as if the case had already begun to take shape in his mind. I could almost feel the hum of his little grey cells at work, even before he spoke. "Ah, Hastings, I am glad to see you back," he said, his voice cool but measured. "And I trust you have brought with you all the necessary details." "Yes." "The grave, the body, and Lady Featherstone's most curious reaction?" I nodded, trying to suppress my impatience. "Indeed, Poirot, the situation is perplexing. The grave has Sir Edward's name, but the body is not his. Lady Featherstone is adamant, but something about her grief doesn't ring true. The doctor is too hesitant, and the vicar, well, I've not had the chance to speak with him much." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile as though he had already anticipated my thoughts. "Very good, Hastings. Now, we must proceed carefully, we? The truth, it is in the details, but these details, they do not yet add up." With that, Poirot donned his coat and gave a sharp nod toward the door. "Let us return to the scene, my friend. There is much more to learn." We made our way back to the village cemetery, where the scene from earlier had not changed. The vicar, Reverend Beaumont, was still there, standing beside the grave with an air of discomfort. Lady Featherstone had retreated some distance away, her face still clouded with distress. Dr. Ashford, the local physician, was speaking in hushed tones to a constable, his hands jittering as he gestured vaguely in the direction of the grave. Poirot's eyes took in the scene with quiet precision, noting the positions of everyone present, the subtle shifts in their body language, the way they avoided looking directly at the grave. It was as though the very act of acknowledging the truth was too difficult for them to bear. "Ah, there is Lady Featherstone," Poirot said softly. "She is not the picture of a widow bereft of her husband, non? Her grief, it is performed, I think." I glanced over at her. She was standing alone now, her back straight and her eyes red-rimmed, but there was something about her posture that seemed far too controlled. In contrast, her eyes seemed to flicker with something, fear, perhaps, or anxiety, when her late husband's name was mentioned by those around her. Poirot observed the woman for a moment longer before he spoke. "There is a nervousness to her."
"Hastings. It is as if she fears something, fears that others will know something about her. Yes, it is subtle, but it is there." I stared at Lady Featherstone for a moment, trying to detect what Poirot had seen.
I could certainly detect the controlled way she held herself, but I had assumed it was merely the stiff dignity of someone trying to maintain composure in the face of a terrible ordeal. Yet Poirot's eyes never missed a detail. He was already making deductions that I could not even begin to follow. We approached the grave, and the vicar turned to us, his face pale. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, his voice faltering. What do you make of this? It is beyond me, I must confess." Poirot gave a polite smile, though his eyes were sharp. "Reverend Beaumont, you were present at the burial."
"No? Tell me, did you personally observe the body before it was laid to rest?" The vicar stiffened, his hands wringing nervously in front of him. I did. Yes. Sir Edward's body was certainly present, Monsieur Poirot. I remember it well."
He was brought in on a cart, wrapped in a blanket, and placed into the grave. I performed the rites myself, as I do for all the villagers." "But did you see the face?" Poirot pressed gently. "Were you certain, absolutely certain, that it was Sir Edward who was buried?" Beaumont hesitated, his gaze darting toward the others.
I did not look closely. It was a hastily arranged affair."
"I was told it was Sir Edward, but—" He trailed off, and I saw the guilt flashing across his face. I did not examine the body in detail. No, I didn't." Poirot's sharp eyes never left the vicar's face. "But now, you are unsure." "Yes," Beaumont took a step back, visibly flustered. "I am not sure of anything any more. Perhaps it was Sir Edward after all."
"But what is this all about? Who else would be buried there?" Poirot's voice was soft, but insistent. "The truth is in the details, mon ami, and these details, they do not add up." Lady Featherstone, who had been watching the exchange from a distance,
now approached. "You are implying that my husband's body is not buried here?" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the slight edge of something unspoken in her tone. Poirot regarded her for a long moment before answering, his voice calm but firm. I imply nothing, madame. I merely seek the truth, as I always do. And the truth, I assure you, is yet to be revealed. Her eyes flickered with something, a momentary flash of emotion that was quickly masked by a cool composure. I will not have you suggesting such a thing. I know my husband's body when I see it. That is my belief. Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. Instead, he turned to Dr. Ashford, who had been listening intently from the sidelines. "Doctor," Poirot said, his voice taking on a more inquisitive tone, "you were present at the time of Sir Edward's disappearance. Yes, you were his physician. What can you tell us of his health? Was there anything unusual about his condition before he vanished?" Dr. Ashford shifted uncomfortably, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. I cannot say much," he muttered. "Sir Edward was in good health as far as I knew, but I had not seen him for some time before he disappeared. He had business interests in London, and I heard nothing until the police came asking questions." Poirot's gaze lingered on the doctor for a moment longer than necessary, before turning back to the grave. "There is more here than meets the eye," he said, almost to himself. "I shall find the truth, one detail at a time." I couldn't shake the feeling that Poirot was already on to something far deeper than I could see. His quiet confidence was unnerving, but at the same time I found myself eager to follow wherever his investigation might lead. As we walked away from the grave, I caught sight of Lady Featherstone once more. Her face was composed, but there was an unmistakable tension in her posture. She had caught sight of us, and for a moment her gaze seemed to linger on Poirot with something like fear. I couldn't understand it. But Poirot? He had already seen everything. And the game, as he liked to say, was afoot. The morning air was still heavy with dampness, the mist that clung to the village making the world feel smaller, as though the entire village were huddling under a blanket of uncertainty. I could sense Poirot's usual composure growing ever sharper, each step and glance calculating. He had already begun to form his conclusions, even if he wasn't yet ready to reveal them. I, on the other hand, was still attempting to piece together the confusing puzzle of Sir Edward's death, feeling the weight of each person's story pressing against me like the fog itself. Poirot's methodical manner was now fully engaged. The investigation was to begin in earnest, and his first move was to conduct a series of interviews. We would speak to those closest to the matter, the ones who had the most to gain or lose, and with Poirot at the helm, I had no doubt we would find something useful, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. We began with Lady Featherstone, who was sitting stiffly in the drawing-room of Featherstone Manor. She appeared to have regained some of her composure since our last meeting at the cemetery, though there was still a tremor in her voice that betrayed her outward calm. "Monsieur."
"Poirot," she began, her gaze steady but calculating, "I must assure you I know nothing of this mystery. Sir Edward was ill, yes, but when I last saw him, he was very much alive. And I cannot understand what you are suggesting." Poirot took his time before responding, his fingers steepling in front of his lips. "Madame, I do not suggest, I only seek the truth. You say Sir Edward was ill. Can you tell me more of this illness? How grave was it?" Lady Featherstone's eyes flickered, her lips tightening ever so slightly. "He was tired, overworked, perhaps stressed by business matters. But that was all. I do not believe his health was so severe as to lead to death. Not."
Like this. Poirot's gaze never wavered from her face, though I sensed that he was taking in the very slightest nuance of her expression.
Yes," he murmured thoughtfully. "You say it was business, but you do not elaborate. What kind of business, madame? Lady Featherstone's fingers tightened around the delicate lace handkerchief she had been clutching. Sir Edward was a man of many interests, Monsieur Poirot. I cannot claim to know every detail of his dealings. But I assure you, nothing in his business could have brought about his demise. Not in that manner. Poirot nodded slowly as though taking in every word. I see. And when you saw him last, madame, what was the nature of your farewell? Lady Featherstone hesitated before responding. We had a brief conversation. He was
In a hurry, I believe. He mentioned something about returning soon, but she trailed off, and I noted the sudden hardness in her eyes as she looked away. Poirot had caught something in her hesitance, something she did not want to reveal, but he said nothing more for the moment, instead turning toward me with a subtle shift in his demeanour. "Come, Hastings, let us speak with the doctor." Dr. Ashford was waiting for us in his office, looking every bit the nervous physician he appeared to be. He stood when we entered, his movements quick and jerky, his brow glistening with a faint sheen of perspiration. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," he began, his voice unsteady. "I trust you are not thinking of implicating me in some misdeed? I assure you I did my duty. I did." Poirot did not respond immediately, instead observing the doctor with that familiar, penetrating gaze. "You are quite anxious, doctor? Is it the subject of Sir Edward's death that disturbs you so?" Dr. Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "It was a tragic thing, that death. He had been unwell, as I said. A fever, fatigue, general decline. It came on quickly, and we did not know what to do. But you were certain, were you not, that Sir Edward
had passed? Poirot pressed. Of course I was certain. The doctor seemed to bristle at the question.
I examined him myself. His pulse was weak, his skin clammy. There was no mistaking it. "Ah, I see," Poirot said, his tone almost clinical. "But you were involved in the arrangements for his burial, were you not? It was you who sent for the undertaker."
"And managed the details of the funeral?" The doctor's face tightened, and his voice dropped to a murmur. "Yes, but I was not alone in that. Lady Featherstone insisted on overseeing everything herself. She was distressed."
Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And the burial itself? Did you witness the placement of the body in the grave?" Dr. Ashford looked away, a momentary flicker of unease crossing his features. "I did not, no. I was, distracted. There was much to do, but I was told that it was Sir Edward. There was no reason to doubt it." Poirot's expression remained impassive, though I could sense the sharpness of his thoughts. No reason to doubt it, you say? But there is always
"Reason to doubt, mon ami, always reason."
The doctor's face grew paler, his fingers clutching the edge of his desk as though holding on to some semblance of control. You don't think I made a mistake, do you?" Poirot stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I do not think anything yet, doctor. But I believe we shall find that many people, when faced with a question, will answer before they have truly thought it through." We left Dr. Ashford's office and walked towards the edge of the grounds, where the cemetery lay in the distance. As we walked, Poirot's pace was measured, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "I must speak with the groundskeeper now," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Mr. Matthews may have seen something important." John Matthews was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a slow gait. He looked at us with a mixture of wariness and indifference as we approached. "You were present during the burial, Matthews," Poirot began. "Can you tell me what you saw that day?" Matthews shrugged, his arms crossed over his chest. "Nothing unusual, monsieur. Just another funeral. I dug the grave, helped lower the body. That's all." Poirot regarded him intently. And you did not notice anything strange in the body, the manner of its arrival, perhaps an unusual smell, a shift in the grave? Matthews shook his head. No, monsieur, everything was normal, just as it always is. Normal, Poirot repeated, his eyes sharp. But normal, my friend, is sometimes the most deceptive of all. I could feel Poirot's mind working, sifting through the layers of information. And then, as though a new thought had occurred to him, he turned to me, his voice calm but edged with something I could not yet place. Hastings, he said, you recall the suggestion of Dr. Ashford that Sir Edward might have been involved in something dangerous, something secret?
A business venture, perhaps, that went awry? What do you make of it? I paused. It was a new direction in the case, one I had not considered, a motive for murder. Yet I couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was off. Poirot seemed
less convinced by the doctor's theory than he let on. We shall see, Poirot said quietly, his eyes narrowing with an almost imperceptible shift of thought. The truth, Hastings, lies in the contradictions. And these people, they are full
of them. As we walked back toward the manor, I was left with a nagging sense of unease.
The first threads of this case were beginning to unravel, but I had no doubt that they were only the beginning. The day had unfolded slowly, a sluggish march from one conversation to the next, each interaction only further entangling the threads
of the case. Poirot was uncharacteristically silent as we made our way back to the cemetery, his steps measured, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat.
I, however, was still reeling from the implications of the morning's interviews. Dr. Ashford's evasiveness, Lady Featherstone's subtle discomfort, everything pointed to the same troubling truth. There was more to Sir Edward's death than met the eye. Yet in the back of my mind I couldn't shake the feeling that Poirot knew more than he was letting on. The little Belgian detective never missed a detail, and it was in his silence that I most often found his thoughts racing ahead
of mine. We arrived at the graveyard, and Poirot stood still for a moment, surveying the surroundings with a critical eye.
The tombstones loomed around us, their names and dates worn with time, the air damp with the scent of earth and moss. The scene felt eerily quiet, almost too quiet, as though the cemetery itself was holding its breath. I must return to the grave. Sight, Hastings, Poirot said, his voice soft but resolute. There is something I have overlooked. I nodded, though I could not fathom what it was that he had missed. The authorities had combed through the graveyard already, and surely nothing could have escaped their notice. But Poirot's belief in the significance of seemingly insignificant details was unshakable. We walked to the grave of Sir Edward, and Poirot paused again, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the wrought-iron fence surrounding the cemetery. His gaze lingered on a spot near the corner of the fence where the metal bars twisted and curled, the pattern strangely interrupted by a piece of fabric that had caught itself among the iron.
"Ah!" Poirot exclaimed suddenly, crouching down to examine it more closely. "What have we here?" I approached, but I knew at once that Poirot had found something of importance. The fabric was dark, frayed at the edges, and unmistakably torn, as
though it had been ripped in haste. Poirot carefully extracted it from the fence and held it up in the light. The fabric was coarse, the pattern distinct, an elegant yet worn checkered design, the kind of material I had seen in the waistcoats of the more fashionable merchants of the town. "It is a torn piece of clothing," Poirot said, examining it with a frown. "But not just any cloth, mon ami. This fabric, it is familiar to me. I have seen it before." I looked at him, bewildered. "Where?" Poirot's sharp eyes flicked over the fabric again, his brow furrowing in concentration. This is from a coat worn by Mr. James Whittaker, the local merchant. Have you not noticed, Hastings? He wears a similar style. Perhaps you remember the last time we saw him, just before Sir Edward disappeared. I could hardly recall the details, but Poirot's deduction made perfect sense. Whittaker had been a prominent figure in the village, a man whose wealth and influence seemed to grow with each passing year. He and Sir Edward had often been seen together at social gatherings, always engaged in whispered conversations, their relationship something of a mystery to those around them. It was said that their business dealings were lucrative, but few knew the true nature of their partnership. But how does this tie into the death? I asked, feeling a new knot of uncertainty tightening in my chest. Sir Edward's body was found here, in his grave, yes, but this doesn't explain how he came to be buried in the wrong one. And if Whittaker's involvement was so direct, wouldn't the authorities have looked into him already? Poirot's eyes twinkled, a glint of satisfaction in them as though a piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. Ah, Hastings, you are correct in your confusion. That is what makes this clue so intriguing. It is not the presence of the fabric itself, but the timing of it and its connection to Whittaker that raises questions. I looked at him, still lost in thought. So you think Whittaker might have
had something to do with Sir Edward's death? But surely that seems too obvious, doesn't it? Poirot raised a finger to his lips, and for a moment I thought he might answer, but he did not. He was, as usual, playing the long game,
waiting for the right moment to reveal his full deductions. After a moment's pause, he spoke again, his voice calm but steady. It is too early to jump to conclusions, Hastings. But this fabric, it tells us something. The presence of Whittaker near the scene of Sir Edward's death is not a coincidence. And the question must be asked, why was he here in the graveyard in the first place? The fabric could not have simply caught here by accident. I watched Poirot, his mind already turning over the possibilities. Do you think Whittaker knew, sir, Edward was going to be buried here, or perhaps was he involved in the burial itself? Poirot stood and turned back toward the grave. Ah, that is the very question we must ask ourselves. But do not be fooled by appearances, Hastings. In matters of this nature, it is not the grand gestures, the obvious motives that reveal the truth. It is the details, the things we overlook. You see, it is always the small inconsistencies that lead us to the heart of the mystery. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air like the mist around us. I could feel my own thoughts shifting, though they still remained tangled and unclear. What had happened to Sir Edward? Why had his body been buried in the wrong grave? And what role did James Whittaker play in all of this? Poirot glanced at me, his eyes sharp with a quiet satisfaction. You are wondering, Hastings, why this clue is significant. The fabric, it is a thread, just one thread of a much larger tapestry.
And though it is too early to know how it all fits together, I can assure you of one thing. The truth lies not in what we see, but in what is hidden from view. He turned and began walking back towards the village, the fabric still clenched in
his hand. I followed, my thoughts racing. There was much to consider, and yet, despite the confusion, I could feel the investigation beginning to take shape. One thing is certain, Hastings, Poirot continued as we walked. The fabric does not lie, and I suspect that it will lead us to the truth. If only we are patient enough to follow it. I could only nod, but in my heart a new question had taken root. Was James Whittaker involved in the death of Sir Edward? Or had this piece of fabric only opened the door to a far more complicated mystery. And as Poirot's steady pace carried us forward, I knew we had only just begun to scratch the surface. The morning light filtered in through the curtains of our modest guest room as I sat across from Poirot, my mind still wrapped around the unsettling discovery from the graveyard, the torn fabric, James Whittaker. The questions that had begun to haunt me were many, but each time I looked to Poirot for answers, he seemed content to let them linger, as though he were waiting for something, a particular moment when everything would fall into place. This morning, the sense of unease hung in the air between us like a thick fog. Poirot had been unusually still during breakfast, his brow furrowed in thought, and it wasn't until after our meal that he spoke again. "We must speak with the key figures again, Hastings. There are things they have not yet revealed. Things they are hiding," I nodded, though in truth I wasn't sure what more we could learn. Still, with Poirot there was always more. There were always threads to pull. The first stop on our list was Lady Featherstone. Her composure was immaculate when we arrived at Featherstone Hall, but beneath her well-maintained exterior I sensed a woman on edge. She was not happy to see us. "Is there something more you wish to ask, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice cool, her posture stiff, as she stood in the grandiose drawing-room, which smelled faintly of lavender and age. "I have already told you everything I know about Sir Edward's passing." Poirot smiled softly, his expression calm. "Madame, it is not a question of what you know, but of what you may not have told me." Her lips pressed together, and for a moment I thought she might refuse to speak any further. But then, with a sharp sigh, she gestured for us to sit. "The nature of my marriage to Edward was complicated, Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice a notch softer now. "We were not the happy couple that others believed us to be. There were difficulties, as there often are. I was often lonely in that house, with only him and the servants for company." I observed her closely, noting the brief tremor in her hand as she reached for her tea. Poirot was, as ever, patient, sitting with an air of utter calm, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her every movement. "Difficulties, madame?" Poirot asked softly. "What kind of difficulties?" Lady Featherstone's eyes flickered, then quickly hardened. Edward was a proud man, a man who believed in his own superiority. But he was also a man who had his needs that he would sometimes fulfill elsewhere. I watched Poirot's face carefully. A subtle change in his expression betrayed his curiosity, though he maintained his practiced neutrality. "Elsewhere? What do you mean by this, madame?" he pressed, his voice mild. She hesitated for a moment, then glanced at me, as if deciding whether to confide in me. "I believe my husband had an affair," she said, her voice low but deliberate. "With
none other than James Whittaker." I nearly gasped, but Poirot simply nodded, taking the information in stride.
"Whittaker, you say? The merchant?" Lady Featherstone looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Yes. I do not know the details, I do not wish to know, but I have seen them together more than once, sharing private conversations that I was not meant to overhear." The revelation hung in the air like a charged storm. Lady Featherstone's discomfort was palpable. I could sense the shift in her demeanour, the flicker of jealousy, the deep well of resentment she had kept hidden. But I could also feel something else, a sense of guilt, perhaps, that she hadn't confessed this to us sooner. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving her face. "Merci, madame. You have been very forthcoming." It seems, however, that there are some questions that remain." Lady Featherstone's lips pressed tightly together, but she said nothing more. Poirot rose smoothly, and we excused ourselves, the tension in the room lingering long after we had left. Our next stop was Dr. Ashford's home, a quaint cottage on the outskirts of Cranford. The doctor's relationship with Sir Edward had always been a peculiar one. Childhood friends, they had grown up together, yet there had always been something slightly off about the doctor's manner. As we entered his home, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth contrasted sharply with the cold, calculating air of our investigation. Dr. Ashford, sitting behind his desk, looked less the professional healer and more the man hiding something, perhaps even from himself. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," the doctor greeted us, his voice strained. "You are back. I assume you have more questions about Sir Edward?" Poirot's gaze softened, though there was no mistaking the intensity behind his words. "Indeed, Dr. Ashford. I must ask you once more about your relationship with Sir Edward. You were childhood friends, were you not?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. "Yes, we were close, very close for many years, but people change, Monsieur Poirot. Life gets in the way, and relationships fray." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but insistent. "And yet when Sir Edward died, you did not seem devastated. There was no grief in your manner." Dr. Ashford's eyes hardened, but he quickly masked it with a thin smile. "Grief is a personal matter. I mourned in my own way. I did what was necessary for the funeral, and then I moved on. There was no need for public displays." Poirot pressed on, his tone barely changing. "And what of the burial? You were the one who conducted the ceremony. Tell me, Dr. Ashford, was everything in order?" The doctor's face tightened, a subtle flicker of unease betraying his outward composure. "Everything was in order, Monsieur Poirot. There was nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Nothing, you say? Not even the choice of grave? The fact that Sir Edward was not buried in the correct plot?" The doctor hesitated, his hand frozen mid-tap on the desk. For a brief moment, I could see the mask crack just enough to reveal something hidden beneath. Something the good doctor was desperate to keep concealed. I did what was necessary, Poirot. The rest is none of your concern." Poirot stood up slowly, his hands folded in front of him. "I think, Dr. Ashford, that we will revisit this conversation. Soon."
Very soon.
With that, he turned and walked toward the door, his movements fluid, though I could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing down on both of us. Dr. Ashford's discomfort was palpable, his emotions barely contained beneath his professional facade. There was something he wasn't telling us, and it seemed that whatever it was, it tied him even more closely to the heart of the mystery. As we left the doctor's home, I felt the unease from our interviews settle heavily on my chest. There was something bigger at play here, something deeper and darker than I had initially suspected. Yet, despite the discomfort that was beginning to spread among the villagers, I still had no clear sense of what the final piece would look like. Poirot, however, seemed oddly calm, his pace unhurried as we walked back to the inn. His mind, I
knew, was working at full speed, pulling the threads together. "Hastings," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The truth, it is like an onion.
Layer by layer, it must be peeled back. But one must not rush. One must be patient." I nodded, though I had no idea what he was thinking, but I trusted him. And I knew that soon enough we would find the answers we were searching for. The sky outside was thick with the promise of rain as Poirot and I returned to the inn after our interview with Dr. Ashford. I had been unable to shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. Despite all the questions Poirot had raised and all the discomfort he had uncovered in the villagers, the truth remained elusive. The more we investigated, the deeper the shadows grew. Each conversation felt like it only revealed more layers, none of which seemed to connect. Poirot, however, was not disheartened. He seemed almost pleased, though.
I could not understand why.
"It is, as they say, an interesting puzzle, mon ami," Poirot remarked quietly, as we sat down in the parlour of the inn, the fire crackling softly in the background. "Each piece, no matter how small, will fit into its place. But we must find the key, the one that unlocks everything." I nodded, though inwardly I felt no closer to that elusive key than when we had first arrived. My thoughts swirled, still circling the tangled relationships and conflicting motives of our suspects. Poirot suddenly turned to me, his eyes gleaming with a new intensity. "Hastings, I have found something." I raised an eyebrow, surprised. "What is it?" Poirot leaned forward, his hands steepled together. "An anonymous letter. One that was hidden in Sir Edward's study, behind a false panel in the desk." I sat up straighter. "A letter? What does it say?" Poirot handed me the letter with a deliberate calmness, as though this discovery was only a small step in a much larger plan. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, and the words were chilling. "You will regret your decision, Edward. If you do not fulfill your obligation, the consequences will be grave. You will lose everything. Consider this."
A warning. Do not test my patience. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I read the letter.
It was filled with menace, but also with a clear threat. A threat that seemed to hint at something far more dangerous than a mere financial dispute. "Do you have any idea who wrote it?" I asked, passing the letter back to Poirot. "I have some thoughts, yes," Poirot replied, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But first, there is the question of the obligation mentioned. What was Sir Edward involved in that might have led to such an ultimatum?" My mind raced. What could be so dire that it had prompted such a veiled threat? And then, like a sudden
flash of light, I remembered something. Langley, I said, the name slipping out before I had time to reconsider. Horace Langley. He had been feuding with Sir Edward over some land deals, hadn't he?
Poirot's eyes sparkled as if I had just solved a small part of the puzzle myself. "Indeed, Horace Langley, a businessman, driven by ambition and greed. There was, as you say, a dispute regarding land. But there is more, much more." We left the inn shortly after, Poirot leading me down the narrow, cobbled streets of Cranford towards Langley's office. The closer we got, the more I could sense Poirot's increasing tension. Langley was now a figure of particular interest to him. When we arrived, the tall, imposing figure of Horace Langley was waiting for us behind his desk, his sharp gaze assessing us as we entered. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," Langley said smoothly, his voice deep and rich. "I understand you have more questions. I can assure you I have nothing to hide." Poirot inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Langley, we are investigating the death of Sir Edward Featherstone, and I must ask you to provide some clarity. It is said that you and Sir Edward had disagreements." Langley's eyes flickered momentarily before his lips curved into a tight smile. "Disagreements? Certainly. Business is rarely free of them, but I would hardly call them personal. Sir Edward and I were competitors, nothing more." Poirot studied him carefully, his gaze unwavering. "But there were threats, were there not, of a financial nature?" Langley's smile faltered, but only for a second. "That's preposterous. I would never stoop to threats. Business is business." Poirot did not seem convinced. "It seems there was more at stake between you and Sir Edward than simple competition."
"I understand there was an ultimatum involved." Langley's eyes hardened, his facade cracking for just a moment. "I don't know what you're talking about. What kind of ultimatum?"
Poirot produced the letter, holding it up for Langley to see. "This one, perhaps?" "It was found in Sir Edward's study, Mr. Langley. A letter from someone who seemed very displeased with Sir Edward's business dealings." Langley's face turned a shade paler as he eyed the letter, and for the briefest of moments his composure slipped entirely. He quickly regained control, though, straightening up in his chair with a defiant look. "That's not mine," Langley said curtly. "I've never written anything like that. I'm afraid you're grasping at straws, Poirot." Poirot remained silent for a long moment, watching Langley closely. I could sense the tension rising, the layers of deception folding over themselves. Langley had reacted far too quickly to the mention of the letter, as though it had touched
A nerve. And the eagerness with which he offered an alibi for his whereabouts the night of Sir Edward's disappearance, his alibi too perfect, too rehearsed, only deepened the suspicion that Poirot seemed to be building against him. After a
few more pointed questions, Poirot and I left Langley's office. It was clear to me that Langley was hiding something, but Poirot's demeanour remained as calm and measured as ever. "Well, mon ami," Poirot said quietly as we walked away, "it seems we are on the right track. Mr. Langley may have provided us with an alibi, but he has yet to explain the letter or his possible involvement in Sir Edward's financial troubles." I furrowed my brow. "But Poirot, this letter, it makes it seem like Langley might be the one behind Sir Edward's
death, doesn't it?"
Poirot turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Ah, Hastings, my dear friend, that is exactly the impression we are meant to have. But I do not believe in coincidences. This is a red herring, I am sure of it." A red herring? I couldn't quite make sense of it. Langley had been too quick to defend himself, too eager to provide an alibi, and now this letter appeared to point to him as a suspect. Poirot, however, remained calm, his mind already shifting towards the next piece of the puzzle. "We shall continue our inquiries, Hastings. The truth is hidden in plain sight, as always. We must not be deceived by these distractions." I said nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this investigation had just taken a darker turn. The walls were closing in on someone, but I still couldn't see who. The air in Cranford had changed, I noted, as we returned to our investigation the following day. There was something heavier now, as though the tension had solidified into a palpable weight. Each morning the fog seemed to rise slower, the chill of the season creeping deeper into our bones. Yet for Poirot there was no hesitation in his step. He moved with purpose, as always, as though every discovery, every step closer to the truth was a victory to be savoured. I, on the other hand, felt more unsettled than ever. The suspects were becoming more tangled, their lies and deceptions more elaborate, but in the midst of it all, Poirot remained a calm eye in a storm. And it was in that calmness that I began to realize something I hadn't before. Poirot was not merely observing. He was pulling on threads, each one leading to a greater understanding, a larger design as clear to him as the lines on a map. It was in the afternoon, after our visit to Langley's office, that Poirot gave me the news. "We are looking in the Christie."
"Wrong direction, mon ami," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but resolute. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The case. It is not as it seems, Poirot replied, his hands folded in front of him as we sat together in a small room
above the inn. There is one person whose involvement I have underestimated. I thought his role to be minor, but it seems I was mistaken. I waited, watching Poirot closely, as though waiting for him to offer me another clue, another piece of the puzzle that would shift everything into place. "Who are you talking about?" I asked carefully, my mind already racing through the possibilities. "James Whittaker," Poirot said, and there was something in his voice, an edge of certainty, that made my stomach tighten. "He is not who he claims to be." I frowned, not understanding. "Whittaker? The local merchant? Surely, Poirot, you cannot mean—" But Poirot was already rising from his chair, his eyes alight with the gleam of discovery. "Exactly, Hastings. Whittaker. He is not the man he claims to be. His entire identity is built on a lie." I stared at him, struck by the suddenness of his assertion. "But he's well known around here. He's respected. You can't possibly—" "Ah, mon ami, you are mistaken," Poirot interrupted gently. "I have investigated further. It is all in the details, small discrepancies in his personal history, trivial things most people would overlook. But I have seen them. And now—"
I am sure. I shook my head, still reeling. James Whittaker, a man I had taken for a simple local merchant, was now under suspicion.
The implications of such a statement were staggering. "But what do you mean? What sort of discrepancies?" Poirot's gaze grew intense, his voice lowered to a near whisper. "I found an old letter, Hastings, written under a different name."
"Entirely." "A different name?" I repeated, my mind spinning. "But—"
"Surely that's impossible." Poirot nodded. "Indeed! And it was not just any letter, it was a letter from an individual with a criminal history. A history that Whittaker has concealed for many years. His real name, it seems, is not Whittaker."
"At all. He is someone else entirely, someone with a past that he has carefully hidden." I could hardly believe it. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, disorienting in its force. James Whittaker, the mild-mannered, well-to-do merchant, was
Not who he appeared to be, but what motive could he have for such a deception? "I've been through his background, Hastings," Poirot continued, pacing now, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "The inconsistencies in his early life, the holes in his records. He has worked hard to erase all traces of his true identity. It is a web of lies spun to conceal his past. But why?" I asked, feeling the weight of the question settle between us. "Why go to such lengths?" Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "That, mon ami, is what we must now discover." I sat back, processing this new information. If Whittaker had been hiding his true identity for all these years, what else was he
hiding. What did he have to gain by being in Cranford? Could he have been involved in Sir Edward's death? The idea felt almost absurd, but Poirot's conviction made me reconsider. It would explain his connection to Lady Featherstone, his proximity
to the scene, and his peculiar behaviour when questioned. Poirot's voice broke through my thoughts. "But there is more. Lady Featherstone's behaviour, it is becoming erratic." I glanced at him sharply. "Lady Featherstone? What do you mean?" Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, a look of quiet amusement playing at the edges of his expression. "She is hiding something. I have seen it. The way she fidgets when she speaks of Sir Edward, how she avoids certain questions, her discomfort is palpable." I frowned. "You think she knows more than she's letting on?" "Exactly, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice dropping low. "She is not as innocent as she pretends. In fact, I believe she may be more involved than we think." I felt a chill run down my spine at Poirot's words. Lady Featherstone, the grieving widow, the woman we had initially believed to be a mere victim in this tragedy, could she really be part of the web of deceit surrounding Sir Edward's death? I stood up abruptly, my thoughts in disarray. "We must speak with her again. There are too many contradictions, too many unanswered questions." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but not just yet, Hastings. We must be patient. In time, the truth will
reveal itself." And as we left the room to prepare for our next visit, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were closing in on something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. The calm facade of Cranford was starting to crack, and beneath it, dark secrets were beginning to rise. The game was changing, and soon someone would make a fatal mistake. The morning after Poirot's unsettling revelations about James Whittaker, I felt a distinct shift in the air, as though the very ground beneath our investigation had been unsettled. There was no longer the luxury of gradual unravelling. The suspects, each in their own way, had become coiled springs, waiting for the right trigger to set them off, and it seemed as if that trigger was approaching. I walked with Poirot through the village, his usual poise and calm betraying none of the gravity of the situation. I, however, could feel the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders. As we passed, the houses, the windows appeared darker than usual, the streets quieter. Everyone was aware of the heightened tension, and even those who had little to do with the case seemed to be holding their breath. Poirot, as ever, seemed immune to the pressure. He took in the village's subtle changes, little more than the flick of a glance, a wrinkle of a brow. Yet it was enough for him. I had long since come to realize that Poirot's mind worked not just by logic, but by intuition, by a finely tuned sense of human nature that saw what others might miss. We had no sooner entered the inn when a messenger arrived, breathless and anxious, with a letter. I watched as Poirot's eyes flicked over it, his expression unreadable, before he passed it to me. It was from Horace Langley. "I have made a grave mistake," it read, "and now it is too late. They are watching me, but it is not safe for you. Leave this place. There will be no answer from me. Langley." The note was cryptic, disturbingly so, but there was no mistaking the urgency of its tone. Langley, the businessman with whom Sir Edward had once been embroiled in a land dispute, had vanished without a trace. I turned the note over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. Had Langley felt cornered? Was this an admission of guilt, or the ramblings of a desperate man? "Poirot, what do you make of it?" I asked, feeling the weight of the note. Poirot glanced at the paper only briefly before turning to me with a sigh. "A confession, perhaps, or perhaps a plea for understanding. But it tells us nothing, Hastings, except that Langley has disappeared. And, if I am to be honest, I am not entirely surprised." I blinked, taken aback. "Not surprised?" Poirot's gaze sharpened, and his voice lowered. "Langley is a man who thrives on control, Hastings. His position, his power, it is everything to him. To be implicated in the death of Sir Edward, to be under suspicion, that would be unbearable. I suspect he has removed himself to avoid what he cannot control." I nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. If Langley was involved in the murder, and I was increasingly inclined to believe that he was, then his disappearance was a calculated move. A desperate one, perhaps, but calculated nonetheless. But as Poirot's words settled into my mind, another thought tugged at the edge of my consciousness. This note, this vanishing act, had a chilling echo of Whittaker's own sudden disappearance. Was there a connection?
And then, just as I had begun to gather my thoughts, a visitor arrived, pale and shaking. It was Mrs. Greaves, the innkeeper. "Sir," she said to Poirot, her voice trembling, I'm afraid something has happened." Poirot, always composed, leaned forward slightly. "What is it, madame?" "It's Mr. Whittaker," she stammered. "He's gone, vanished, disappeared." A chill crept up my spine. The timing was too uncanny. First Langley, and now Whittaker, two men with ties to Sir Edward's death, had disappeared within hours of each other. I exchanged a glance with Poirot, who, as usual, appeared unaffected, but I could see the subtle tightening of his jaw. "Have you any idea where he might have gone?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. Mrs. Greaves shook her head, the colour draining from her face. "None, sir. He had a row with you earlier, didn't he? After that he went up to his room, and now he's gone." Poirot stood, his mind already racing. "We will go to his room," he said, "and we will see what we can discover." We followed Mrs. Greaves to Whittaker's room, where the door stood ajar. The bed was neatly made, the room undisturbed, save for a single object lying on the floor. A letter. I stepped forward and picked it up. It was addressed to Poirot. "I know what you are thinking," it began. "I know the questions you will ask, but understand this. I had no choice. You will find no answers from me, only from those who are left behind." The letter was brief, almost too brief, but it was enough to add another layer to the mystery. Whittaker's sudden disappearance was no accident. It was the action of a man who feared what was to come. But why write to Poirot, and why leave? This cryptic message— Poirot took the letter from my hand, his expression unreadable. "I had hoped I would not be forced to make such a conclusion so soon," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it seems there is no longer any doubt. Mr. Whittaker is involved, but how?" I could see the cogs turning in Poirot's mind, but he said nothing more. I felt the tension mounting again. Was Whittaker the key to it all? Or had something deeper, something even more dangerous, been concealed all along? As we left the room, the silence in the inn felt heavier than ever. Whittaker's disappearance, and Langley's before him, was not just a flight from the law. No, there was more to this, something Poirot had yet to reveal. But I could see it in his eyes. The answer was close, very close. And as we prepared to leave, there was an unsettling sense that the case was now moving toward a conclusion no one would expect. The evening air was cool as we walked through the narrow corridors of Featherstone Manor. Inside, the grande drawing room awaited, its velvet curtains drawn tight against the fading daylight. Poirot, as ever, exuded calm, but I felt a tension in the air, a palpable weight. Something was building, and I knew that tonight would be the end of it. The threads of this case had wound tight, each lead pointing to a new, more complex tangle of lies and deceit. The truth, when it came, would shatter illusions. We had invited all the key players of the investigation to this room: Lady Featherstone, Dr. Gilbert Ashford, Horace Langley's sudden reappearance, and the few others whose actions had been caught in the web of suspicion. The tension was high. Lady Featherstone sat rigidly in her seat, her eyes darting nervously toward Dr. Ashford, who, in turn, refused to meet anyone's gaze for more than a moment. Poirot, ever the master of psychological games, stood by the grand fireplace, a figure of quiet authority. I had witnessed many such moments, but this time even Poirot's usual coolness seemed to heighten the suspense. His gaze swept over the room, lingering on each face, but he said nothing for several
minutes. The silence stretched on, the weight of it making my heart race.
Finally, Poirot spoke, his voice a soft, controlled murmur. Mon ami Hastings, you have seen the evidence. You have observed the reactions of our suspects. You know the pieces of the puzzle. But now I will tell you how it all fits together. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the gathered crowd. Let us begin with the grave. The wrong one, Poirot said. Sir Edward was buried in the wrong place, of that there can be no doubt. It was a mistake, a careless error. Or was it? Lady Featherstone shifted in her chair, her fingers curling around the edge of the seat, as if trying to steady herself. Her eyes darted nervously, and I could see a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool air. Poirot's gaze sharpened.
Ah, but it was no mistake. No, it was a deliberate act, carried out in haste, driven by panic. The room held its breath. Dr. Ashford, perhaps you can explain why Sir Edward was buried in such a hasty and incorrect manner? Why the grave of a man who did not fit the description? A mistake or an attempt to cover up the truth? Dr. Ashford flinched, and I saw his fingers twitch slightly in his lap. The smooth, composed exterior that had previously shielded him was slipping, revealing
something darker beneath. His mouth opened, but no words came. Poirot's eyes never left him. You were with Sir Edward on the night of his death, were you not? You were, after all, a childhood friend. Perhaps you felt that you owed him something, or perhaps you felt betrayed. The doctor's face turned, pale as his mouth tightened. I don't know what you mean, he muttered. I have already told you everything. Poirot, however, remained unshaken.
Ah, but there are things that have not been told, non? A relationship more complicated than you let on. A man who felt betrayed by his wife, and perhaps by you as well. Lady Featherstone, she knew the truth. But you, Dr. Ashford, were driven
by something else entirely. Lady Featherstone's eyes widened as the weight of Poirot's words settled on her like a shroud. Her hands fluttered to her throat, as if trying to keep her composure, but it was clear that Poirot was now speaking not just to Ashford, but to her as well. Poirot continued, his tone deliberate. The affair, it was not a secret, was it? The passion, the jealousy. Dr. Ashford, you did not kill Sir Edward out of any malice toward him alone. No, you killed him because you feared losing her. He turned to Lady Featherstone. You were the motive, the object of desire, the passion
that blinded Dr. Ashford to reason. Lady Featherstone trembled slightly, her expression faltering.
She opened her mouth to speak, but Poirot raised a hand to silence her. No, no, he said quietly. You need not speak, madame. The truth is there for all to see. The silence in the room was oppressive now, every eye fixed on Dr. Ashford. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the composure he had worked so hard to maintain crumbled entirely. You killed him, didn't you? Poirot pressed. In a fit of jealousy, you took his life.
You thought that if you could dispose of Sir Edward, you could finally have Lady Featherstone to yourself. Dr. Ashford stood suddenly, his face contorted in desperation. You don't understand, you... His voice broke, and for a moment I thought he might collapse. Ah, but I do understand, Poirot said, his voice as calm as ever. The coat, the fabric, the small detail that gave you away. I saw Dr. Ashford's eyes flicker, the truth sinking in.
His eyes darted around the room as though looking for a way out, but there was none. You discarded your coat in a moment of panic, didn't you? Poirot said, his voice taking on the quiet rhythm of a man wrapping up a conclusion. That fabric found in the grave, It matched your coat, the one you threw aside in haste. The mistake of the grave, it was your attempt to cover up the crime, a rushed burial to hide the truth. Dr. Ashford's face turned a sickly shade of grey. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I do," Poirot replied softly, stepping closer. "The jealousy, the rage, your actions were not those of a calm man. They were the actions of a man who thought he had nothing left to lose." There was a long pause, the weight of Poirot's words settling like a thick fog around the room. The other suspects sat in stunned silence, absorbing the unravelling truth. Poirot's gaze moved slowly over each of them, but it was Dr. Ashford who felt the full brunt of his scrutiny. "You thought you could hide behind your calm demeanour," Poirot continued, "but the truth was always there, in the cracks and the small details, the truth you could not escape." With a final weary sigh, Dr. Ashford sank into the chair behind him. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked like a man defeated. Poirot's eyes softened just for a moment. "It is over," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. The room was still, the tension broken at last. Dr. Ashford had been revealed as the murderer, the one who had killed in a fit of jealousy, the one who had sought to cover his tracks by burying Sir Edward in the wrong grave. The truth, though painful, had finally come to light. And as the night unfolded, I knew that justice would take its course. But the quiet satisfaction of knowing the mystery had been solved would linger in my mind for much longer. The village of Cranford, though small and peaceful, seemed to bear the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. The arrest of Dr. Gilbert Ashford had sent ripples of disbelief and shock through the community, but as the days passed, a curious kind of stillness began to settle. In the wake of the revelations, the village slowly began its tentative return to normality, though one could not help but feel the lingering tension in the air, like the aftertaste of something bitter. Lady Featherstone, once the proud matriarch of the manor, had retreated from public life entirely. She rarely ventured out, her face a study in resignation. The scandal, the betrayal, the knowledge that her actions had inadvertently led to the murder of her husband had left her hollow. There was no one left to whom she could turn for solace, her position now irrevocably tarnished. She had been complicit in her own way, though I knew from the beginning that her involvement had been born more of fear than malice. But as Poirot had often reminded me, it is not the intent, but the consequences that matter most. I had not seen Poirot much in the days following the arrest. He was, as always, a man of quiet contemplation, taking time to reflect on the case after its resolution. I, on the other hand, was left with the task of smoothing over the more immediate effects of the scandal on the villagers. There were whispers in every corner of the village, and though the truth had been uncovered, the wound remained fresh, open, and bleeding. On this particular afternoon, Poirot invited me to join him for a final walk around the village before he departed. We had both spent our time quietly, but I had begun to feel a certain weight in my chest, the sort of heavy silence that comes only when a case has ended and all that remains is the echo of its revelations. I knew that Poirot's departure was imminent, and yet, as always, he seemed in no hurry to rush to the train station. Instead, we strolled in silence, passing the familiar cottages and shops of Cranford, the very same ones that had been the backdrop to such a horrific tragedy. At length, Poirot spoke, his voice quiet but full of the wisdom I had come to cherish. "It is over, mon ami, but it is not always so simple, is it? His words hung in the air for a moment, as though he had more to say but chose not to. I looked at him, perplexed. "What do you mean, Poirot? It is over, isn't it? The murderer has been found. The truth has come to light. What more is there?" Poirot smiled softly, the kind of smile that was more knowing than anything else. "Ah, Hastings, you are a man of logic. You see the case as a puzzle to be solved, and once it is, the solution brings clarity, yes?" He paused, his gaze turning inward, as though reflecting on some deeper truth. "But the human heart, my friend, is not so easily unravelled. You think Dr. Ashford's motives were clear, yes? Jealousy, fear, love unrequited, all very tidy, very simple. But the truth of the matter, I think, is far more complicated. I had never been quite sure what Poirot meant when he said things like this. There were times when he saw deeper into a situation than I ever could. It was a gift, or perhaps more accurately, a curse. "But Lady Featherstone," I said, turning the conversation toward her, "she will never recover from this. The life she knew is gone. Perhaps she will never be forgiven." Poirot's face softened for a moment, and I could see the quiet sorrow in his eyes. "Ah, but you are wrong, mon ami. There are many ways to seek redemption. Her punishment, in a sense, is already much greater than anything the law could impose. She must live with the knowledge of her own part in the tragedy. That is the true penalty. There is no escaping that." I glanced over at him, trying to understand. "You really believe that, Poirot?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine for a moment. Then he said, almost as if to himself, "One must not let the little grey cells grow too complacent, mon ami, for the heart often reveals the truth when the mind is too eager to overlook it." I frowned, unsure what he meant, but Poirot's cryptic words were often like that, layered, mysterious, designed to make me think, to reconsider my understanding of human nature. I had learned not to press him for answers too soon. The walk ended quietly as we made our way toward the small train station at the edge of the village. I had come to expect nothing less from Poirot's final moments in a case, always measured, always full of quiet contemplation. His departure would be as discreet as his arrival had been. The village of Cranford would soon go back to its daily rhythms, its gossip, and its routines, but I could sense that it had been forever changed. The quiet peace that had returned to the village was uneasy, like a storm that had passed, leaving behind a strange calm. As Poirot's cab drew up to the station, I could see the familiar glint in his eye, the same one that had guided him through countless cases, the one that told me he was already thinking ahead. He was, in his own way, always looking to the next puzzle, but it was also clear that his heart, as much as his mind, was always the greatest mystery of all. "Will you be back, Poirot?" I asked, almost without thinking. He gave me one of his rare smiles, his lips curling slightly. "One
day, mon ami, but for now it is time to rest."
And with that, he stepped into the cab and was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the lingering scent of his cologne. The village, I knew, would never truly return to the way it had been. The shadows of the past would linger in its corners, but the world would continue as it always did. People would come and go, mysteries would be solved and unsolved, but somehow it was clear that Poirot's unique brilliance would never be replaced. And as the train pulled away, taking him to his next adventure, I realized that perhaps that was the greatest mystery of all, the quiet man who understood the human heart better than anyone else, and who always seem to know that, in the end, it is not the case that defines us, but the choices we make once the truth is known.